The heart monitor didn't skip a single beat. Its rhythmic, neon green pulse the only thing proving Omar Delgado was still a man and not a statue. He lay perfectly still in the sterile silence of the ICU, trapped inside a body that refused to move, listening to his own life being negotiated in the hallway. It was a cruel irony. A man who had built an empire by silencing his enemies was now being silenced by a plastic oxygen cannula and a "do not resuscitate" order. He had been in this state for 48 hours, ever since the accident that Kenji Morita, his right-hand man of 20 years, had described to the doctors with a grief so perfectly practiced it was indistinguishable from loyalty. He wouldn't want to live like this, his wife, Mara, had whispered to the lawyer, her voice trembling with the kind of manufactured sorrow that masks a celebration. In their world, a boss who can't speak is a boss who doesn't exist. They hadn't realized that while Omar's lungs were struggling, his mind was a steel trap, recording every treacherous word spoken over his dying breath. The betrayal was a slow-burning fuse inside his chest, one that wouldn't lead to a recovery, but a reckoning. Because when a man is left to die by the people he trusted most, he doesn't pray for a miracle. He waits for the moment to strike back. And that moment arrived with the vibration of a smartphone, tucked under his pillow by a pair of trembling, calloused hands. The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator was the only thing anchoring Omar Delgado to the land of the living, a cruel metronome measuring out the seconds of his supposed expiration. He lay encased in the sterile chill of the ICU, his body a heavy, useless weight beneath the light blue hospital gown. To the world outside the glass, he was a fallen titan, a vegetable awaiting the harvest. But behind his wide, glassy eyes, Omar was screaming. The nasal cannula felt like a branding iron across his face, and the medical tape on his cheek pulled with every shallow, forced breath, yet he remained perfectly, deathly still. He had learned more about his life in the last 48 hours of silence than he had in 50 years of shouting. His gaze was fixed on the large observation window at the foot of his bed. Beyond the glass, the hallway was dim, a long corridor of shadows that seemed to stretch into a bleak eternity. But directly across from him, in the small, private waiting nook reserved for the families of the elite, sat the architects of his ruin. The lighting in their little corner was warm, a sharp, insulting contrast to the cold, blue-white glare of the monitors surrounding Omar's bed. Mara, his wife, looked radiant even in her grief. She wore a black silk dress that cost more than the hospital wing, and though her eyes were shielded by oversized designer sunglasses, Omar knew they weren't red from crying. She was leaning back in a plush chair, her posture relaxed in a way he hadn't seen in years. There was no tension in her shoulders, no fear of the man who usually occupied the room next door. Beside her stood Kenji Morita, Omar's right hand, his brother in everything but blood. Kenji was still wearing his tailored suit, the sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the heavy gold watch Omar had gifted him for his 20th year of service. Omar watched, his jaw tightening beneath the tape, as Kenji reached into a small leather bag and pulled out a bottle of vintage cognac and 2 crystal tumblers. It was the good stuff, the 1945 reserve Omar kept in the floor safe of his study. The sight of it was a physical blow, a sharper pain than the bullet that had shattered his spine. They weren't just taking his life, they were raiding his temple before the body was even cold. With a steady hand, Kenji poured the amber liquid. He didn't look like a man mourning a mentor. He looked like a man who had finally stepped out of a very long shadow. He handed a glass to Mara, and for a fleeting second, their fingers lingered, a touch that was far too intimate, far too certain. Omar felt a surge of white-hot rage that threatened to blow the sensors right off his chest. The green waveforms on the monitor beside his head spiked, a jagged mountain range of fury, but the machines were too impersonal to translate his heart's cry. To the nurses at the station, it was just another fluke in a dying man's telemetry. Mara lifted her glass, the crystal catching the warm orange glow of the lamp. She didn't offer a silent prayer or a somber nod toward the dying man behind the glass. Instead, She leaned in, whispering something into Kenji's ear that made his lips curl into a slow, predatory smile. They clinked their glasses together. The faint, sharp ping of crystal on crystal echoed in the silence of Omar's mind, louder than a gunshot. They drank. They drank to the empty chair at the head of the table. They drank to the keys they had already duplicated and the codes they had already changed. Mara laughed, a soft, melodic sound that Omar could almost hear through the soundproof glass. It was the laugh of a woman who had just been set free. Omar's hand, resting limp on the thin hospital sheet, twitched almost imperceptibly. His mind raced, cataloging the betrayal with the cold precision of a ledger. He thought of his daughter, Maya, likely tucked away in some boarding school or locked in her room, unaware that her mother was toasting her father's execution. He realized then that he had been a fool. He had built a fortress of steel and blood, but he had left the gates wide open for the people he loved. As Kenji stood up to refill the glasses, he glanced toward the ICU window. For a second, his eyes met Omar's wide, staring gaze. A normal man would have flinched, would have seen the accusation in those glassy depths. But Kenji simply adjusted his tie, gave a mock solemn nod of his head, as if acknowledging a piece of furniture, and turned back to Mara. They were so sure. They were so incredibly certain that the man in the blue gown was already gone. They were treating his ICU room like a front-row seat to a show they had already finished writing. But as Omar watched the amber liquid disappear down Kenji's throat, he felt a strange, cold clarity wash over him. The grief was gone, replaced by a singular, vibrating purpose. They wanted him to die in the quiet, in the sterile dark, forgotten and erased. But they had forgotten one thing. Omar Delgado never left a job unfinished. He closed his eyes for a moment, the rhythmic whoosh hiss of the ventilator sounding less like a life support machine and more like a bellows stoking a fire. He wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a witness. And if he could just find a way to move his hand, to reach the small, cold weight he felt tucked beneath his pillow, the gift the maid, Zara, had risked her life to leave him. He would show them exactly what happened when you left a king to die, without making sure his heart had stopped beating. The glass wall between them felt like a mountain, but to Omar, it was becoming a lens. He was seeing the world for what it truly was for the first time in his life. The drink was finished, the bottle was capped, and as Mara leaned her head on Kenji's shoulder, Omar began the slow, agonizing process of reclaiming his fingers. He wasn't going to die in this room. He was going to burn the world they thought they'd inherited to the ground. The digital clock on the wall of the ICU didn't tick. It simply bled red numbers into the darkness, marking the arrival of 3 in the morning. The hospital was a tomb of hushed whispers and the distant, rhythmic squeak of a nurse's cart. But in Omar's room, the silence was heavy, almost physical. The cold, blue-white glow of the monitors had dimmed as the machines slipped into their night mode displays, leaving Omar alone with the shadows of his own thoughts. For hours, he had focused every ounce of his remaining will on his right hand. It felt like a lead weight, a disconnected object that belonged to someone else. He had visualized the nerve endings firing, imagined the blood pumping through his veins, and ignored the protesting ache in his chest. He wasn't a man who prayed, but in the stillness, he bargained with whatever force governed the universe. "Just an inch," he pleaded. "Give me 1 inch." His fingers lay curled near the edge of the stiff hospital sheet, inches away from the rectangular lump Zara had hidden beneath his pillow. He could feel the cold edge of the smartphone through the cotton. It was his only weapon, a slim piece of glass and silicon that held the power to topple the kingdom he had spent 30 years building. With a grunt that never left his throat, Omar forced a final, agonizing surge of energy into his forearm. His index finger twitched. Then, with a slow, trembling slide that felt like dragging a boulder uphill, his hand moved. The sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he couldn't wipe it away. His fingertips finally brushed the cool, smooth surface of the device. He hooked his thumb under the edge of the phone and dragged it toward him. Every millimeter was a battle against the paralysis, against the exhaustion that threatened to pull him back into the gray fog of his coma. Slowly, he angled the device so the screen faced his glassy eyes. The display was set to 0% brightness, Zara's foresight, a silent testament to her tactical mind. Even so, in the pitch-black room, the faint shimmer of the screen felt like a spotlight. Omar's heart hammered against his ribs, the EKG monitor chirping a frantic warning that he prayed the nurses at the station would ignore as another agitated sleep spike. His thumb hovered, shaking violently, over the play icon on the video file. He hesitated for a heartbeat. Once he pressed this, there would be no going back to the man he was before the ICU. The world would be divided into those he would kill and those who might help him survive. He tapped the glass. The video began without sound at first, a grainy, high-angle shot taken from the corner of his private study at the estate. The lighting was warm and orange, the familiar glow of the fireplace he had sat beside every winter evening. Two figures stood in the center of the frame, their silhouettes sharp and unmistakable. Kenji was leaning against Omar's mahogany desk, his posture relaxed, almost arrogant. He was holding a file, the Delgado Trust, and he was laughing. Mara walked into the frame, her back to the camera, but Omar knew that sway in her hips anywhere. She reached out and traced the line of Kenji's jaw with a familiarity that made Omar's blood turn to ice. Then, the audio kicked in, a low-volume hiss that Omar had to strain to hear over the ventilator. The doctor said the paperwork will be ready by Friday. Mara's voice came through the speaker, crisp and devoid of the mourning widow tremor she had used earlier that evening. One signature, Kenji. That's all it takes to end the Delgado era. And the girl? Kenji asked, his voice casual, as if he were asking about the weather. Maya is the only loose thread. The board won't accept me as regent if she's still in the picture to claim the inheritance when she turns 18. Mara didn't hesitate. She stepped closer to Kenji, her silhouette merging with his in the dim light of the screen. Maya will be sent to the school in Switzerland. I've already spoken to the headmaster. She won't be coming home for the holidays. Or ever. We'll make sure her grief becomes too much for her to handle. Omar watched as his wife and his best friend shared a kiss over the documents of his own death. It wasn't just a betrayal of his life. It was a betrayal of his blood. They were discussing his daughter like a piece of unwanted furniture to be discarded. The phone screen went dark as the video ended, reflecting Omar's own face back at him in the faint red light of the clock. His wide eyes were no longer glassy with illness. They were burning with a cold, predatory light. The distress and disbelief that had clouded his features for days evaporated, replaced by a singular, focused rage. The machines continued their rhythmic humming, indifferent to the fact that the man they were keeping alive had just died and been reborn as a ghost. Omar let the phone slide back under the pillow, his hand finally relaxing, though his mind was now a war room. They thought they had left a vegetable in this bed. They thought they had secured their future with a bottle of cognac and a pen. But as the red numbers on the wall shifted to 301, Omar Delgado made a silent vow. He would play the part of the dying man. He would let them sign their papers and plan their funerals. And when they reached for his crown, he would be the one waiting in the shadows to take their lives. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to begin the long, silent count until the morning. The video was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The video didn't end with the kiss. As the timestamp on the screen ticked forward, the camera angle shifted slightly, the perspective clear and unwavering. A hidden lens Zara must have placed weeks ago, sensing the rot before Omar ever did. On the small screen, the silhouettes of Kenji and Mara moved from the center of the office toward the heavy mahogany desk where Omar had spent half his life commanding the city. Mara sat in his executive chair, her fingers trailing over the leather armrests with a sickening sense of ownership. She leaned back, staring up at the ceiling, and let out a sharp, jagged laugh that cut through the low hum of the ICU machines. "You have no idea how long I've waited to see him look that small," she said, her voice dripping with a venom that had been brewing for years. The great Omar Delgado, reduced to a collection of tubes and beeping boxes. He looks like a broken toy, Kenji. Kenji didn't laugh immediately. He paced the length of the rug, his silhouette looming large against the flickering light of the fireplace. The hit was messy, he grumbled, though there was no regret in his tone. The driver should have finished it on the bridge. If the paramedics hadn't arrived when they did, we wouldn't be playing this game of grieving family at the hospital. We took a risk leaving it to the doctors. The doctors are on the payroll, Kenji. Don't be so paranoid, Mara countered, waving a dismissive hand. She reached for a crystal decanter on the desk, Omar's favorite, and poured a splash of amber liquid into a glass. Estelle has the medical board in her pocket. They'll declare him brain dead by Friday. It's cleaner this way. A tragic accident, a lingering coma, and then peace. No investigations. No internal wars with the other families. Just a smooth transition of power to the woman who suffered by his side for 20 years. Kenji finally stopped pacing. He leaned over the desk, his shadow falling across Mara like a shroud. And the men? The captains won't just bow to you because you're wearing black. They need to know I'm the one holding the gun now. They'll know, Mara whispered, and even through the tinny phone speaker, the coldness in her voice made Omar's skin crawl. We'll tell them the Russians did it. We'll give them a war to distract them while we consolidate the accounts. By the time they realize you and I are sharing a bed and a bank account, it will be too late for any of them to do anything about it. She took a slow, deliberate sip of the drink. Did you see his face when the truck hit? The cameras at the intersection caught a glimpse. For 1 second, he actually looked surprised. The man who thinks he knows everything didn't see his own best friend coming. Kenji let out a low, guttural chuckle. He trusted me. That was his first mistake. He thought loyalty was something you could buy with a gold watch and a percentage of the docks. He never understood that some people want the whole clock, Omar. Omar lay in the ICU bed, the smartphone screen casting a faint, flickering light against his pale, stubbled face. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with a mixture of agony and a terrifying, crystalline clarity. The betrayal wasn't just a business move, it was a performance. They were mocking his life, his choices, and the very foundation of the loyalty he had demanded from his soldiers. On the screen, Mara stood up and walked toward the window, her silhouette framed by the moonlight of the estate. I want his ring, she said suddenly. The gold one with the crest. I noticed it was still on his finger today. Tell the nurses to take it off. It's bad luck for a dead man to keep his jewelry. I'll take care of it, Kenji promised, along with everything else. The video cut to black, the 0% brightness of the screen reflecting the hollowed-out expression of a man who had just watched his entire world being sold for parts. Omar felt the familiar, rigid tension return to his limbs, but this time, it wasn't the paralysis of the stroke. It was the tension of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to spring. The machines continued their rhythmic, indifferent chorus, whoosh, hiss, beep. They thought the man in the bed was a shell, a memory in a hospital gown. They thought the office was theirs, the cognac was theirs, and the future was theirs. But as Omar slid the phone back under the safety of his pillow, his mind was no longer in the ICU. He was already back in that office, standing in the shadows, waiting for the fireplace to die down so he could show them what happened to those who mistook a temporary silence for a permanent end. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was counting down the hours until the accident became theirs. The morning sun didn't bring light to the ICU. It brought a cold, clinical glare that bounced off the linoleum floors and the stainless steel trays. Omar had spent the dawn hours in a state of hypervigilance, his mind sharpening even as he forced his body to remain a slack, unresponsive weight. He had tucked the phone deep beneath the mattress, feeling like a soldier hiding his last grenade in a foxhole. He was ready for the next move in their game, but he wasn't prepared for the sheer efficiency of it. The heavy double doors of the unit swung open with a hiss, and the sound of sharp, rhythmic footsteps announced the arrival of Estelle Marchand. Omar didn't need to see her face to know her. He knew the sound of those $400 heels on hard tile. Estelle had been the Delgado family lawyer for a decade, a woman who treated the law like a set of suggestions and loyalty like a commodity. She walked into the room with a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, followed closely by a young resident who looked like he hadn't slept in 36 hours. Estelle didn't look at Omar as a person. She looked at him like a closing file. She stood at the foot of his bed, her expression a mask of professional solemnity that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Doctor, we've discussed this," Estelle said, her voice a low, commanding alto that filled the small space. "The family is in agreement. Mr. Delgado was a man of immense dignity. He left very specific verbal instructions regarding his quality of life. Seeing him like this, it's a violation of everything he stood for." The young doctor hesitated, glancing at the monitors. "I understand, Ms. Marchand, but the latest EG showed some unexplained spikes in neural activity last night. It's subtle, but it suggests he might not be as far gone as the initial scans indicated. We should run another." "Another scan is a waste of time and his estate's resources," Estelle interrupted, her tone sharpening like a blade. She opened the portfolio, pulling out a thick stack of documents. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, and looked official enough to bury a man alive. "I have the Do Not Resuscitate orders here, along with the authorization to withdraw life support. Mrs. Delgado has already signed her portion. We are simply waiting for the hospital's compliance." Omar felt a cold shiver of rage vibrate through his chest. He watched through half-closed lids as Estelle uncapped a heavy fountain pen. It was a gold-plated instrument, a gift he had given her after she successfully bribed a judge in the waterfront case. Now, she was using that same gold to sign his death warrant. "We need to move quickly," Estelle pressured, stepping closer to the doctor. "The press is already circling the hospital. If word gets out that the head of the Delgado organization is lingering in a vegetative state, it puts the entire city's stability at risk. Kenji Morita is prepared to step in as interim lead to keep the peace, but he can't do that while Omar is technically occupying the throne." The resident shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Omar's motionless face. "It's just the ethics of withdrawing support so soon after the incident." "The ethics are simple, Doctor," Estelle snapped, her eyes narrowing. "The man is dead. His heart just hasn't realized it yet. Are you going to be the one to tell Mrs. Delgado that you're extending her husband's suffering for the sake of a few unexplained spikes on a screen?" She held the pen out to the doctor, the gold barrel gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It was a silent ultimatum. Omar watched the tip of the pen, knowing that if that ink hit the paper, he would be legally erased before he could ever find the strength to speak. The Do Not Resuscitate order wasn't a mercy, it was a silencer. "Sign it," she urged, her voice dropping to a persuasive whisper. "Let him have his dignity. Let the family begin to heal." The doctor reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he took the pen. Omar's heart rate began to climb, a frantic drumming against his ribs that he couldn't suppress. He needed a miracle. He needed a distraction. He needed something to stop that pen from touching the page. But even as the doctor lowered the nib toward the signature line, Omar realized that Estelle wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was a scavenger, picking at the bones of an empire she thought was already dead. He stared at her, memorizing the cold, calculated curve of her lips. She thought she was signing a death warrant, but she was really signing her own confession. The doctor's hand froze just millimeters from the paper. The door to the ICU swung open again, and the sound of a tray rattling broke the tension. Zara, the maid, walked in with a stack of fresh linens, her eyes downcast, her movements invisible and unimportant to the power brokers in the room. For a split second, her gaze flickered toward Omar, and then toward the pen. "I'll give you 10 minutes to finalize the clinical notes, Doctor," Estelle said, sensing the hesitation. She set the papers down on the rolling bedside table, the very table where Omar's hand lay hidden beneath the sheet. "Then we end this." As they stepped into the hallway to speak in private, leaving the documents behind, Omar felt the heat of the rage finally overcome the chill of the medicine. The pen was sitting there. The papers were waiting. And for the first time since the truck hit him, Omar Delgado didn't just want to survive. He wanted to burn the world down, starting with the ink on that page. The door to the ICU swung shut with a heavy, pressurized thud, sealing the room into a vacuum of artificial light and mechanical breathing. Estelle and the doctor were gone, their voices fading into a muffled debate in the hallway, but the documents remained. The "Do Not Resuscitate" order sat on the rolling table like a predator waiting for the night to fall. Omar watched the stack of paper through half-closed lids, his mind screaming at his body to move, to burn, to do anything but exist as a silent witness to his own erasure. Then, the soft, rhythmic swish of a mop against the floor broke through the hum of the monitors. Zara Ndiaye didn't enter the room with the arrogance of a lawyer or the coldness of a traitor. She moved with a practiced, invisible grace, her head bowed as she worked, a woman who had spent years being part of the furniture in the Delgado mansion. To the guards outside and the conspirators in the hall, she was a nonentity, a pair of hands to scrub the blood and the bleach. But to Omar, she was the only human being left in a room full of vultures. She moved closer to the bed, her movements methodical. As she reached the bedside table to move the water pitcher, her hand brushed the edge of the legal documents. She paused, her dark eyes flickering over the bold, black lettering of the death warrant. Omar saw her jaw tighten, a brief flash of defiance crossing her features before she smoothed it back into a mask of servitude. Omar knew this was his only window. The fog of the medication was thick, but the adrenaline of the last 10 minutes had cleared a path through the haze. He focused every ounce of his consciousness on his eyes. He didn't try to move his hand this time. He needed something more direct, something undeniable. Zara looked up, her gaze drifting toward his face as she reached for a cleaning cloth. Usually, she would look away out of respect, but something in the stillness of the room made her stop. Omar waited until her eyes met his, and then, with a slow, deliberate force, he blinked. Not the fluttering, reflexive blink of a dying man, but a sharp, rhythmic closure. 1, 2, 3. Zara froze. The cloth in her hand remained suspended in midair. She didn't gasp. She had lived in the Delgado household long enough to know that a gasp could be a death sentence. She leaned in closer, her face inches from his, her eyes searching the glassy depths of his own. "Mr. Delgado," she whispered, her voice so low it was barely a vibration against the hiss of the ventilator. Omar didn't blink again. Instead, he shifted his gaze, slowly, painfully, down toward the pillow where the phone was hidden, and then back to her. Then, he looked at the gold fountain pen Estelle had left behind on the table. He repeated the movement, tracing a path from the secret phone to the pen, and finally, his gaze settled on her with a look of desperate, burning command. Zara's breath hitched. She looked toward the hallway door, then back to Omar. She understood. She had seen the video she helped him watch. She knew what was on the table. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was the custodian of a king's last stand. With a movement so fluid it looked like part of her cleaning routine, Zara reached out and adjusted his pillow. As she did, her fingers brushed the phone, confirming it was still there. Then, she reached for the gold fountain pen. She didn't steal it. She simply nudged it, sliding it deep into the pocket of her apron. Finally, she took the "Do Not Resuscitate" papers and placed a heavy medical tray directly on top of them, obscuring the signature line from view should the doctor return too quickly. "I see you, sir," she murmured, her voice trembling but certain. "I see what they are doing. They think I am nothing. They think because I clean their floors, I do not hear their hearts." She leaned over him, pretending to check the 4-line, but her hand found his, the one hidden beneath the sheet. She gave it a single, firm squeeze. It was a pact signed in the silence of the ICU, a bridge built between the most powerful man in the city and the woman the world ignored. "They are coming back in 5 minutes," she whispered, her eyes locked onto his. "I will be in the hallway. If you need me to stay, if you need me to fight, blink twice." Omar didn't hesitate. He closed his eyes twice, the movement firm and final. Zara nodded once, a sharp, soldierly gesture. She picked up her mop and resumed her work, her face returning to the empty, subservient expression the world expected of her. But as she moved toward the door, Omar felt a shift in the room's energy. The cold, sterile isolation of the last 48 hours had been broken. He was no longer a man left to die. He was a man with an operative. The glass wall was still there, and the traitors were still waiting for the ink to dry. But as the red numbers on the clock shifted forward, Omar Delgado felt the first true spark of hope. He had an ally in the shadows, and in the world of the Mafia, the person no one notices is always the most dangerous person in the room. The pact was made. The invisible had joined the dead, and together they were going to make the living pay. The sterile silence of the ICU was deceptive, a thin veil draped over a high-stakes battlefield. For Omar, time had ceased to be measured in hours and was now counted in the excruciating millimeters of movement he could reclaim from his own recalcitrant nerves. Since Zara's departure, he had been working in the shadows of his own skin, pushing against the heavy, invisible sludge that paralyzed him. Every breath was a calculation, every twitch was a victory. He focused on his right index finger. He didn't just want to move it, he needed to command it. He visualized the electrical signals as bolts of blue lightning traveling down from his brain, through the wreckage of his spine, and into the dormant muscle. He ignored the sweat that began to itch beneath his nasal cannula, and the way his heart rate monitor began to tick a fraction faster, its rhythmic ping threatening to betray his internal exertion. Move, he commanded. Move for Maya. Move to burn the papers. The tip of his finger scraped against the stiff, starchy hospital sheet. It was a minuscule sound, no louder than a dry leaf skittering across pavement. But to Omar, it felt like a thunderclap. Encouraged by the spark of sensation, he pushed harder, curling the knuckle upward. His hand was beginning to wake up, a sleeping predator stirring in a cave of white linen. Suddenly, the heavy door hissed open. The sound was sharp and sudden, an intrusion that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Omar's system. He immediately tried to go limp, to sink back into the facade of the vegetable they expected him to be. But his body was mid-contraction, and his muscles didn't respond to this stop command as quickly as they had to the go. A nurse entered, a woman named Elena who had been on the night shift, known for her terrifyingly observant nature and a no-nonsense attitude toward patient vitals. She wasn't like the resident. She was seasoned, and she trusted her eyes more than the machines. She walked straight to the fore-pump, her sneakers squeaking with a sound that felt like a siren in Omar's ears. "Let's see how we're doing this afternoon, Mr. Delgado," she murmured, her voice a practiced, professional hum. She checked the bag, then turned her attention to his vitals monitor. Omar watched her through the slits of his eyelids, keeping his breathing shallow and mechanical, mimicking the ventilator's pace. But his right hand, his traitorous, awakening hand, was still partially tensed. The index finger was hooked, suspended a fraction of an inch off the bed. Elena's gaze drifted from the screen down to the bed. She paused, her brow furrowing. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out for the very sheet where his hand lay exposed. "That's strange," she whispered to herself. She reached down and gently touched the back of his hand. Omar felt the warmth of her fingers, a stark contrast to the clinical chill of the room. He had to make a choice: let the tension remain and risk her calling the doctor for an immediate neurological exam, or force the muscle to collapse and risk a visible spasm. If she saw him move now, the room would be flooded with specialists. Estelle would be alerted. The window of secrecy Zara had helped him open would be slammed shut. As her thumb brushed his knuckle, Omar didn't just relax. He willed his body to become stone. He visualized his arm as a piece of cold, dead driftwood washed up on a shore. He let the energy drain out of his hand, allowing the finger to drop back onto the mattress with the limp, heavy thud of true paralysis. Elena lingered, her hand still resting on his. She was waiting. She was looking for a reflex, a twitch, a sign of life. Omar stared at the ceiling, his eyes fixed and glassy, refusing to let even a hint of recognition enter his pupils. His heart was a hammer in his chest, and on the monitor, the EKG line began to dance with a frantic, jagged energy. Heart rate is climbing again, she noted, her voice tinged with suspicion. She leaned over him, her face inches from his, checking the dilation of his pupils with a small penlight. The white light was blinding, a searing needle in his brain, but Omar didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He let the light wash over him as if he were already a ghost. Just another spike, a voice called from the doorway. It was the young resident from earlier, sticking his head in. Marchand is breathing down the chief's neck in the hall. She wants the final assessment done by 4. Don't go looking for ghosts, Elena. We have enough problems. The nurse sighed, a long, weary sound of a woman who knew something was wrong, but was being told to ignore it by the powers that be. She gave Omar's hand one last, lingering look before pulling the sheet up to cover his wrist, hiding his progress once more. I could have sworn. She trailed off, then shook her head. Fine. He's all yours. She followed the resident out, the door sealing shut behind them with that same agonizingly slow hiss. Omar waited until the footsteps vanished, until the hallway was silent once more. Then, and only then, he let out a jagged, silent breath. He lifted his hand again. This time, his index finger didn't just twitch, it tapped the bed in a deliberate, rhythmic beat. He was still in the game. He was still a secret. But as the clock on the wall moved closer to 4, Omar realized he didn't have much time left to be a ghost. He needed to become the man who walked through doors with a bullet, even if he had to start with just one finger. The afternoon sun began to retreat, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ICU floor that looked like the bars of a cage. The heavy door hissed open once more, but the footsteps that followed were not the sharp, aggressive clicks of Estelle's heels or the squeak of the nurse's sneakers. These were light, hesitant, and uneven. Omar's heart didn't just spike, it ached. He knew that gait. Mara entered first, her black veil pushed back to reveal eyes that were dry and perfectly made up. She was leading Maya by the hand, though it looked more like she was dragging a captive. At 8 years old, Maya looked impossibly small in the vast, machine-filled room. She was wearing her school uniform, a pleated navy skirt and a white blouse, and she was clutching a tattered stuffed rabbit as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Go on, Maya, Mara said, her voice dropping into that soft, performative register she used for the public. She gave the girl a gentle nudge toward the bed. Say goodbye to Daddy. The doctors say he's going to a peaceful place soon. Omar felt a scream tear through his mind, a primal roar of protective fury. Don't tell her that. Don't you dare tell her that. He watched through the slits of his eyelids as Maya approached. Her face was pale, her lower lip trembling so violently she had to bite it to stay quiet. She stopped at the edge of the bed, her head barely reaching the level of his mattress. Mara stood by the window, checking her gold watch, her silhouette framed by the dying light. She was a statue of indifference, already mentally moving into the master bedroom of the estate. She didn't look at her daughter. She looked at the hallway, waiting for the lawyer to return with the finality of the ink. Maya reached out a tiny, shaking hand. She didn't touch the wires or the tubes. She laid her palm flat against Omar's forearm, right over the tattoo that marked his life before the war, before the throne. Her skin was warm, vibrant, and so painfully alive. Daddy, she whispered. The word was a fragile thread in the sterile silence. They said you can't hear me. They said your mind is in the clouds. A single tear escaped her eye, trailing a shimmering path down her cheek before landing on Omar's skin. It felt like a drop of liquid fire. I don't want you to go to the clouds, she sobbed, her voice breaking into a jagged, rhythmic cry. Mommy said you're tired, but you're the strongest man in the world. You told me Delgados never quit. You told me we always come home. She leaned forward, burying her face into the crook of his motionless elbow. The heat of her grief washed over him, a tidal wave of reality that shattered the last of the medicinal fog. Omar felt the weight of her tears soaking into his hospital gown. This wasn't a business betrayal anymore. This wasn't about the docks or the trusts or the gold watches. This was about the only thing in 50 years he had ever truly built with love. I am here, Maya, he thought, the words vibrating through every cell of his being. "I am right here." Mara sighed loudly from the window. "That's enough, Maya. We have to let the nurses do their job. Come along." "No," Maya cried, her grip tightening on his arm. "He's warm. He's still warm, Mommy." In that moment, the rage that had been a slow-burning fuse in Omar's chest detonated. It wasn't the cold, calculated anger of a mafia boss. It was the desperate, miraculous power of a father. He didn't think about the nerves, or the blue lightning, or the "do not resuscitate" order. He simply refused to let her go. His fingers, which had struggled for hours to move a single millimeter, suddenly surged with a terrifying, raw energy. His hand didn't just twitch, it closed. Omar's large, scarred fingers wrapped around Maya's small hand, anchoring her to him. It was a firm, unmistakable squeeze. Maya gasped, her breath catching in a sob. She looked up, her eyes wide and searching. "Daddy." Mara turned from the window, her face pale. "Maya, don't be silly, it's just a reflex. The nerves." But Omar wasn't finished. With a Herculean effort that felt like tearing his own soul out of the earth, he forced his eyelids open. He didn't look at the monitors. He didn't look at the lawyers standing in the doorway with the pen. He looked directly into his daughter's tear-streaked eyes. He couldn't speak. The ventilator was still huffing its mechanical breath into his lungs, but his gaze was a roar. It was a promise of blood and a promise of protection. Mara took a step back, her hand flying to her throat. The widow mask shattered, revealing a raw, naked terror. She saw the life in his eyes, the cold, predatory intelligence of the man she had tried to kill. "Doctor!" Mara screamed, her voice hitting a panicked, shrill note that echoed down the hallway. "Doctor, something is wrong. He's looking at me." But Maya didn't pull away. She leaned in, a radiant, tearful smile breaking across her face. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew you wouldn't leave me." Omar held her hand tighter, the EKG monitor behind him screaming in a frantic, joyful cadence. The miraculous recovery had begun, but it wasn't for the sake of medicine. It was for the sake of the girl who had brought a dead man back to life with a single tear. The hunt was no longer in the shadows. Omar Delgado was awake, and the world was about to find out exactly what happened when a ghost decided to come home. The scheduled hour of Omar's execution arrived with a heavy, overcast sky that drained the color from the morning. At precisely 8 a.m., the heavy double doors of the ICU wing swung open to admit the procession of death. Mara led the way, her face veiled in lace that was as dark as her intentions, flanked by Kenji and a grim-faced Estelle Marchand. Behind them followed the chief of medicine and 2 orderlies, wheeling a cart laden with the legal paperwork and the equipment necessary to silence the machines once and for all. There was a predatory stillness in the group. Kenji adjusted his cuffs, his eyes already scanning the room for the gold ring he had promised to take from Omar's finger. Mara clutched a lace handkerchief, her shoulders trembling with the fake tremors of a grieving widow, though her heart was likely racing with the thrill of a jackpot won. They had spent the night dividing the waterfront properties and the offshore accounts. Now, they only needed to clear the throne. The doctor stepped forward, his hand on the handle of the door to Omar's private suite. "I must warn you," he began, his voice a low, somber drone. "Once we begin the process, the transition will be rapid. We've already administered the sedative to ensure he feels no." He pushed the door open, and the sentence died in his throat. The room was bathed in the harsh, flickering gray of the morning. The rhythmic whoosh hiss of the ventilator was still audible, but it was huffing into empty air. The ICU bed was a chaotic wreck of white linen and tangled wires. The nasal oxygen cannula lay discarded on the floor like a shed snakeskin, and the 4 poles stood naked, their bags of saline and morphine dripping uselessly onto the linoleum. Omar Delgado was gone. Mara let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her handkerchief fluttering to the floor. "Where is he? Where did you move him?" she demanded, her voice losing its mournful lilt and snapping into a tone of sharp, jagged panic. The doctor stood frozen, his mouth agape. He rushed to the bedside, his hands hovering over the empty mattress as if he expected Omar to materialize out of the fabric. This is impossible. He was paralyzed. He couldn't even sit up without assistance. Kenji pushed past the orderlies, his eyes darting around the sterile room like a trapped animal. He saw it first. At the far end of the room, the heavy, reinforced safety window, a pane that required a specialized key to unlock, was standing wide open. The cold, damp morning air rushed in, billowing the privacy curtains like the sails of a ghost ship. Kenji ran to the window, leaning out into the gray mist. The ICU was on the second floor, overlooking a service alley used for medical waste and oxygen tank deliveries. Below, there were no shattered bodies, no pools of blood. There was only the muddy track of a vehicle that had clearly idled there for a long time before speeding away. He didn't walk out of here, Kenji hissed, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He turned back to the room, his gaze landing on the floor beneath the bed. There, half hidden by the bed skirt, lay a single, crumpled item, a yellow rubber cleaning glove. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The invisible help had not been so invisible after all. The maid, Estelle whispered, her legal portfolio slipping from her numb fingers. Zura. She didn't show up for her shift this morning. Mara grabbed the edge of the empty bed, her knuckles turning white. The terrifying reality began to sink in. The man they had mocked, the man they had left to die, was no longer under their control. He was a ghost in a city he knew better than anyone, and he had been awake long enough to hear every word of their treason. Search the hospital, Mara shrieked, her mask finally falling away to reveal the frantic, ugly terror beneath. Check the cameras. He can't have gone far. He's a dead man. He's supposed to be dead. But Kenji wasn't listening. He walked slowly to the bedside table. The gold fountain pen was gone. The "Do Not Resuscitate" papers were still there, but someone had scrawled a single word across the signature line in a dark, jagged hand that looked like it had been carved with a bayonet. Run. The machines continued to beep, their warnings now echoing in an empty room. The hunters had become the prey in the span of a heartbeat. As the hospital staff scrambled and the sirens began to wail in the distance, the empty bed stood as a silent monument to their failure. Omar Delgado hadn't just survived. He had escaped the grave they dug for him, and he had taken the truth with him into the shadows. The morning mist clinging to the hospital's glass exterior felt like a shroud, but inside the executive suite of the Delgado estate, the air was thick with the ozone of pure panic. Kenji Morita paced the length of the mahogany-paneled office, his movements no longer the calculated strides of a successor, but the frantic lunges of a cornered animal. Every time his phone vibrated, he flinched, expecting to hear the rasping, gravelly voice of a man who should have been dead. Mara sat in the center of the room, her black lace veil discarded on the floor like a dead moth. Her makeup, once a perfect mask of grief, was now smeared, revealing the hollowed-out terror beneath. She clutched a glass of cognac, the same vintage they had toasted with just nights before, but her hands shook so violently the crystal clattered against her teeth. How does a man who can't walk vanish from a high-security wing? Mara's voice was a jagged whisper, climbing toward a hysterical edge. He was hooked to machines, Kenji. He was dying. People don't just wake up from a coma and hop out of a second-story window. He didn't hop, Mara. He was taken, Kenji snapped, stopping in front of the window and staring out at the rolling hills of the estate. The maid. Zura. We underestimated the one person who spent 18 hours a day in that room. She didn't just clean the floors. She was his eyes when he couldn't use his own. She's been working with someone. He turned back to the room, his eyes dark with a murderous intensity. I've had the boys check the harbor, the safe houses, even the private clinics. Nothing. It's like he turned into smoke the second he hit the pavement. But he's out there. And he has that phone. The mention of the phone sent a fresh jolt of ice through Mara's veins. That device contained the digital record of their treason, the laughter, the kisses, the casual discussion of Maya's exile. It wasn't just a video. It was a death warrant signed in their own voices. We have to find him before he reaches the captains, Mara urged, standing up so abruptly her chair nearly toppled. If he gets to Vinny or the Gallo brothers with that footage, we won't even make it to the driveway. They'll skin us alive just to show him their loyalty. I know, Kenji bellowed, slamming his fist onto the desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I've already put a bounty on the maid's head. I told the street crews that she kidnapped him, that she's a Russian plant trying to ransom the boss. We're framing it as a rescue mission. If they find him first, they'll bring him to me, and I'll finish what the truck started. But the lie felt thin, even to his own ears. Omar Delgado wasn't a man who could be easily hidden, yet the city felt suddenly, ominously empty. Every black sedan that turned into the cul-de-sac, every shadow that shifted in the garden, felt like the beginning of a reckoning. What if he's already talked to them? Mara whispered, her eyes wide and glassy. What if he's just waiting, watching us? He always loved a theatrical exit, Kenji. He's the ghost in the machine now. Kenji didn't answer. He was staring at the surveillance monitors on the wall. The camera feeds from the hospital showed a blur of movement. Zara pushing a laundry cart, a black van idling in the service lane, but Omar himself was never visible. He had moved through the blind spots like a man who had designed them himself. He's weak, Kenji said, more to convince himself than Mara. He's been on a ventilator for days. His muscles are wasted. Even with the maid's help, he can't last long without medical attention. We just have to squeeze the city until he pops out. He reached for his coat, his jaw set in a hard, desperate line. I'm going to the docks. If he's trying to get out of the city, that's where he'll go. You stay here. Lock the gates. Don't let anyone in. Not the lawyers, not the guards, no one. And Maya? Mara asked, a sudden flicker of maternal self-preservation crossing her face. Forget Maya. Kenji spat as he headed for the door. If Omar gets to her, the game is over. Right now, we aren't hunting a man anymore, Mara. We're hunting a ghost. And you can't kill a ghost twice. As the door slammed shut, Mara was left alone in the vast, silent office. She looked at the desk, at the empty chair where Omar used to sit, and for the first time, she felt the true weight of the silence. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. Somewhere in the sprawling gray of the city, her husband was breathing, and with every breath, he was coming closer to home. The basement of the Delgado estate felt colder than the ICU, a subterranean tomb of concrete and reinforced steel that smelled of old dust and dry security. Omar moved through the dark like a predator returning to a den he no longer recognized. His body was a map of agony. Every step was a victory of sheer willpower over the lingering tremors in his legs. Beside him, Zara moved like a shadow, her hand hovering near his elbow, ready to catch him but wise enough to let him lead. She had driven the van through the back service entrance, bypassing the primary security sensors he had installed a decade ago, loopholes he had kept for himself for a day just like this. He reached the heavy steel door of his private vault, hidden behind a false wine rack in the cellar. His fingers, still stiff and clumsy, hovered over the biometric scanner. For a terrifying second, he feared the machine wouldn't recognize him, that the trauma of the accident or the weight of his death had altered him beyond recognition. But the light flickered from red to a soft, inviting green. The heavy bolts retracted with a deep, metallic thud that vibrated in his marrow. Omar pushed the door open. This room was the heart of his empire, the place where the true numbers were kept, the offshore account ledgers, the emergency cash, and the dirt he held on every politician from here to the capital. But as the lights hummed to life, he didn't find the pristine sanctuary he had left behind. The floor was littered with discarded folders. Several safety deposit boxes had been pried open, their contents scattered like autumn leaves. Omar ignored the physical mess and went straight to the primary terminal, the encrypted workstation that controlled the ghost accounts, the untraceable funds designed for a total collapse. His breath caught as he pulled up the logs. The screen flickered, displaying a flurry of activity from less than 12 hours ago. The access code used wasn't Kenji's, and it wasn't Mara's. It was a master override belonging to Estelle Marchand. She didn't even wait for the body to get cold. Omar rasped, his voice sounding like dry parchment. He watched the data stream. Estelle had attempted to trigger a mass wire transfer of $40 million to a holding company in the Cayman Islands. It was a scorched earth move, the kind of theft that signaled she wasn't just working for the new regime, she was planning to flee it. But as he scrolled deeper, a grim, jagged smile touched his lips. The transfers were marked with a bold, flashing red status. Pending, dual authentication required. In her haste and arrogance, Estelle had forgotten the Delgado protocol. To move the core assets, the system required a secondary physical key, a unique encrypted drive Omar kept on a chain around his neck. He reached up, his hand brushing the cold metal of the flash drive that was still tucked beneath his shirt, hidden by the hospital gown Zara had helped him change out of hours ago. They had searched his pockets, they had debated taking his ring, but they had never bothered to look at the religious medal he wore. She tried to bleed me dry, Zara, Omar said, his eyes fixed on the screen. She tried to take the money meant for Maya's future to fund her escape. She thinks you are a ghost, sir, Zara murmured from the doorway, her eyes scanning the security monitors that showed the empty hallways above. And ghosts do not need money. Omar leaned heavily against the desk, the rage providing a temporary scaffolding for his broken body. He saw the digital fingerprints of his lawyer's greed everywhere. She hadn't just tried to move the money. She had accessed the black ledger, the digital file containing the names of his informants. She was selling him out, piece by piece, to the highest bidder, likely the Russians Petrov had mentioned in the video. He didn't stop the transfers. Instead, he sat at the terminal, his fingers dancing over the keys with a lethal precision. He didn't just want to keep his money. He wanted to bait a trap. He altered the destination of the pending wire. He didn't send it back to his own accounts. He routed it to a public charity fund for the families of fallen police officers, anonymously, but in a way that would trigger an immediate federal audit of Estelle's private firm the moment she tried to cancel the transaction. If she wants to play with my legacy, Omar hissed, she can explain it to the IRS and the district attorney. He stood up, his legs shaking but holding. He reached into the back of the safe and pulled out a heavy, matte black handgun and 2 spare magazines. He checked the action, the familiar mechanical slide providing more comfort than any medical monitor ever could. They took my life, they took my health, and they tried to take my daughter's bread, he said, turning toward the door. But they forgot to check the vault. I still have the keys to the kingdom, and I'm about to change all the locks. The basement was silent again as he stepped back into the shadows. The lawyer thought she was rich. The wife thought she was free. The best friend thought he was king. But as Omar Delgado ascended the stairs, he wasn't a patient, and he wasn't a victim. He was the auditor, and the debt was about to be paid in full. The black-draped ballroom of the Delgado estate felt less like a place of mourning and more like a coronation chamber. Crystal chandeliers were dimmed, their light filtered through layers of charcoal silk, casting long, dancing shadows across the faces of the city's most dangerous men. Waiters in white gloves moved like ghosts among the captains and lieutenants, serving top-shelf bourbon and caviar as if the blood hadn't just been scrubbed from the ICU floors 24 hours ago. It was a celebration of life, a theatrical farce designed to bury Omar Delgado's memory under a mountain of expensive hors d'oeuvres and manufactured grief. At the far end of the hall, a massive portrait of Omar had been mounted on an easel. He looked formidable in the painting, his eyes cold and commanding, a king in his prime. But the man in the painting was already being treated as ancient history. Kenji Morita stood at the center of the room, the gold watch on his wrist catching the dim light every time he raised his glass. He wasn't wearing the face of a grieving brother anymore. He was wearing the face of a man who had already measured the crown and found it a perfect fit. Beside him, Mara was a vision of tragic elegance, her black lace dress hugging her figure, her eyes shielded by a thin veil that hid the predatory gleam of a woman who had finally cashed in her biggest chip. To the memory of a titan, Kenji announced, his voice booming across the silent room as he signaled for the music to stop. The crowd gathered in a semicircle, their faces unreadable, waiting to see if the wolf standing before them truly had the teeth to lead the pack. Omar Delgado taught us that loyalty is the only currency that matters, and in his absence, we must ensure that his legacy and his family is protected by those who knew him best. Mara leaned into Kenji's side, a subtle, public confirmation of the new alliance. "We have lived in the shadow of a mountain for a long time," she added, her voice smooth and practiced. "But tonight, we look toward the sunrise. The business continues. The Delgado name remains, but the hand on the wheel has changed." In the back of the room, Estelle Marchand stood near the bar, her fingers tight around her clutch. She looked pale, her eyes darting toward the entrance every few seconds. She had spent the last 2 hours trying to figure out why her wire transfers were showing as completed, yet the bank in the Caymans had no record of the funds. She was a woman standing on a trapdoor, and she could feel the rope tightening around her neck, even if she didn't know who was pulling it. The atmosphere in the room was electric, a volatile mix of ambition and uncertainty. The Gallo brothers were whispering in the corner, their eyes fixed on Kenji. They were predators sensing a shift in the wind. To them, the fact that Omar's body was missing was a complication, but the promise of increased percentages under Kenji's regime was a powerful sedative for their suspicions. Before the night ends, Kenji continued, stepping onto the small dais that held the portrait. "We will formalize the transition. The captains have already been briefed. The offshore accounts are being consolidated. By morning, the Delgado organization will be stronger, leaner, and more united than ever." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy gold signet ring, the one Mara had recovered from the estate's private safe. He held it up, the light reflecting off the family crest. It was the ultimate symbol of authority. In the tradition of their world, the man who wore the ring held the life and death of every person in the room. "For Omar," Kenji said, his voice dropping to a reverent, chilling whisper. He began to slide the ring onto his own finger, his eyes locked on Mara's. She smiled, a thin, sharp curve of her lips that signaled the final victory. The air in the ballroom seemed to grow heavy, the silence so profound that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer sounded like a hammer against stone. They thought the play was over. They thought the final act was the crowning of a new king. They didn't see the flickering of the security monitors in the hallway or the way the guards at the perimeter had suddenly stopped responding to their radios. They didn't notice the faint, rhythmic hiss of a ventilator that seemed to echo in the vents, or the way the shadows behind the black curtains were beginning to move. The celebration was at its peak. The traitors were toasted, the wine was flowing, and the crown was inches from Kenji's knuckle. But as the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom began to creak open, the warm, orange light of the party felt suddenly, violently cold. The dead man was no longer in the ICU, and the celebration of life was about to become a very real lesson in the finality of death. "One signature left," Kenji whispered to Mara, his hand hovering over the ring. He didn't know that the signature had already been written in blood, and the man who owned the hand was standing in the dark, watching his own funeral. The heavy oak doors didn't swing open with the grand, sweeping flair of a celebration. They groaned on their hinges, a slow, agonizing sound that cut through Kenji's speech like a blade through silk. The laughter in the ballroom died a sudden, violent death. A wave of cold air rolled in from the hallway, extinguishing the warmth of the expensive bourbon and the smell of roasting meat. Every head turned, every hand froze mid-toast, as a figure emerged from the shadows of the foyer. Omar Delgado didn't look like the man in the portrait. He looked like a nightmare that had crawled out of a shallow grave. He was wearing his favorite charcoal suit, but it hung loosely on a frame that had been hollowed out by the ICU. His face was a pale, gaunt mask, his eyes sunken into deep, dark hollows, yet they burned with a terrifying, crystalline fire. He leaned heavily on a cane, his steps slow and uneven, yet each strike of the rubber tip against the marble floor echoed like a drumbeat of doom. Beside him, Zara walked with her head held high, no longer the invisible maid, but the shield-bearer for a resurrected king. Kenji's hand froze with the gold signet ring halfway onto his knuckle. His face drained of color, turning a sickly, translucent gray. Mara let out a sound that wasn't a scream, but a soft, pathetic whimper, her glass of cognac slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. The droplets of amber liquid splattered her black silk dress, looking like fresh bloodstains in the dim light. The celebration seems to have started without the guest of honor, Omar rasped. His voice was a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards themselves. It was weak, but in the absolute silence of the room, it carried the weight of a mountain. Omar didn't stop until he reached the edge of the dais, standing directly in front of his own mourning portrait. He looked at the painting, then at Kenji, then at Mara, the captains in the room. Men who had seen every kind of violence the city had to offer, stepped back instinctively, clearing a path for a man they had already written off as a corpse. "You speak of loyalty, Kenji," Omar said, his gaze shifting to the gold ring. "You speak of protecting my legacy, but your voice sounds different when you think I'm not listening." Kenji found his voice, though it was thin and brittle. "Omar, this is a miracle. We thought the Russians. The only Russians in this room are the ones you sold my daughter to." Omar interrupted, his eyes narrowing. He didn't raise his voice, but the chill in the air intensified. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek remote. With a single click, the giant banquet screens that had been displaying a slideshow of Omar's life flickered and went dark. A low, digital hiss filled the ballroom. The screen flared to life, but it wasn't a memory. It was the footage from the ICU. The room watched in a paralyzing trance as the video played, the warm, orange-lit office where Kenji and Mara toasted to Omar's death. The audio, amplified by the ballroom's high-end sound system, filled every corner of the hall. Mara's laugh, sharp and cruel, echoed off the chandeliers. Kenji's voice, discussing the accident and the plan to exile little Maya, boomed with a clarity that made several captains reach for their holsters. The image shifted to the ICU, showing Estelle Marchand hovering over Omar's bed with the gold pen, pressuring the doctor to sign the death warrant. The betrayal was no longer a secret whispered in the dark. It was a panoramic spectacle of treason. The silence that followed the end of the video was more deafening than the audio itself. Mara was shaking so hard, she had to grab the easel of the portrait to stay standing. Kenji looked at the captains, his eyes darting for a friendly face, but he found only the cold, hard stares of men who valued loyalty above all else, or at least the appearance of it. "A man's life is a long book, Kenji," Omar said, taking a step toward the dais. "But the last chapter is always the shortest. You and Mara were so eager to write the ending that you forgot I still had the pen." He turned his gaze toward the back of the room, where Estelle was already trying to slip toward the service exit, only to find two of Omar's most loyal, old guard soldiers standing in her way. "I have been to the land of the dead," Omar whispered, standing tall despite the cane, his silhouette overlapping with the painted image of his former self. "And I have returned with a list. It starts with the two of you." He didn't need to draw a weapon. The power in the room had shifted back to its rightful owner with the force of a tidal wave. The resurrection was complete, but as Omar looked at his wife and his brother, the fire in his eyes promised that for them, the funeral was only just beginning. The silence that followed the digital revelation of the video was not empty. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of a falling empire. Omar Delgado did not bark orders or call for a firing squad. He simply leaned on his cane and let the truth do the work of 1,000 soldiers. As the captains and lieutenants realized they had been toasting to a coup led by a fraud and a snake, the air in the ballroom shifted from celebration to a cold, predatory judgment. Kenji Morita, the man who would be king, was stripped of his gold watch and his dignity before the screens had even faded to black. He didn't fight back. He knew the rules of the world he lived in. To beg was to admit he was smaller than the shadow he had tried to outrun. Omar didn't take his life. That would have been too quick, too merciful for a brother who had toasted his death with vintage cognac. Instead, he sentenced Kenji to the one thing he feared more than a bullet: obscurity. He was stripped of his name, his assets, and his protection, cast out into the city streets as a marked man with a debt that could never be paid. Mara, once the polished jewel of the Delgado estate, looked like a fractured mirror. Omar watched her with a detached, clinical pity. There would be no dramatic parting, no final argument. He simply had the locks on the master suite changed and her accounts frozen. "You said you waited a long time to see me look small," Omar said, his voice a low rasp that carried to the back of the room. "Now, you can spend the rest of your life realizing how large the world is when you have no one left to betray." She was escorted out by the very guards who had taken her orders an hour before, her designer heels clicking a hollow, lonely rhythm on the driveway. Estelle Marchand, the lawyer who treated the law like a suggestion, found that the law had a very long memory. The black ledger Omar had manipulated in the vault triggered a cascade of federal inquiries that would ensure she spent the next 2 decades defending herself from behind a different kind of glass. When the room was finally purged of the rot, Omar turned to the woman standing at his side. Zara Ndiaye had expected to go back to her mop and her silence, but Omar had seen the soul of his empire in her eyes. He didn't offer her a reward. He offered her a seat at the table. He promoted her to chief of staff, not just for the mansion, but for the organization. "The people who clean the floors are the only ones who know where the stains are," he told his remaining captains. "From now on, no one moves without her word." Months later, the Todd Hill mansion no longer smelled of sterile grief or cold mahogany. It smelled of wood smoke, fresh air, and the chaotic, beautiful scent of a home being lived in. The schedules and intervals that had once defined Omar's life were gone, replaced by the unpredictable rhythm of a father who finally understood his true wealth. Omar sat in his study, the room where the betrayal had been filmed, but the mahogany desk was now covered in Maya's drawings and a tattered stuffed rabbit. He no longer spent his nights counting crates at the docks or monitoring offshore wires. Instead, he spent them on the floor of the library, building fortresses out of sofa cushions and learning the names of Maya's school friends. He walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the price he had paid for his blindness, but he walked toward his daughter every time she called his name. He had traded a kingdom of fear for a kingdom of laughter. He realized that the greatest mistake of his life wasn't trusting the wrong people, but failing to be present for the right ones. As he watched Maya run through the garden, the late afternoon sun catching her hair, Omar Delgado finally understood what the ICU had tried to teach him. A man is not defined by the empire he builds, but by the family that refuses to let him die. The Delgado era hadn't ended. It had simply been reborn. And for the first time in 50 years, the boss wasn't just a leader of men. He was a father, a protector, and a man who finally knew the difference between being served and being loved. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever had a moment where you realized the people you trusted most weren't who they claimed to be? Or perhaps you've experienced a miraculous turning point that changed your perspective on what truly matters. Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Your stories are the heartbeat of what we do. If this tale of betrayal and redemption touched your soul, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay safe and keep your love